we have some of our archiving fellows here, some of our AAI students here, which is our high school program, and we have parent here, and some of our staff here. And if you all look, you all know some of our community events. We have book talks for everybody to come in, but we really wanted this space to be very intimate for you all, right? Some of you all have been with us all of the summer, and are going to continue to finish out the fellowship and the internship in the fall and the spring. And so we wanted to come together and just create an intimate space for you all to share some of the work that you've been doing, right? Because we're going to hear from you all after, but also really learn about Dr. Albert Camarillo and the work that he's done. And he's a Compton native. And so we're going to talk a little bit about his book here. This is his latest book, Compton In My Soul. And then I'll give a brief intro into who he is. And then we're just going to have a conversation. He's going to share his experience, some of his work. And then we'll leave it open for some questions that you all maybe have of what he shares. So I have your bio here. Okay. So Dr. Camarillo, a member of the Stanford University History Department since 1975, Camarillo is widely regarded as one of the founding scholars of the field of Mexican American history and Chicano Studies. He was born and raised in South Central Los Angeles community of Compton, where he attended the Compton Public Schools before entering the University of California at Los Angeles as a freshman in 1966. He continued his education at UCLA in the Ph.D. program in the U.S. History Department, where he received his doctorate in 1975, and where his dissertation was nominated that year as one of the best Ph.D. theses in the nation in American history. Camarillo has published several books and dozens of articles and essays dealing with the experiences of Mexican Americans and other racial and immigrant groups in American cities. So yeah, let's go.
Thank you. It's special for me to be here with you today because, as Abigail's mentioned, this is where I was born and raised. So we're all connected, right? We're all connected. Before I begin, I want to just identify, welcome Gustavo Arellano from the Los Angeles Times, a friend, and arguably the most talented, important commentator in the Los Angeles Times in Southern California about our communities, right? So it's wonderful to have you here today, Gustavo. So Abigail mentioned I wrote this book, right? So I don't want you guys to think of me about as the professor from Stanford University. I want you to think of me as one of you. I'm just way older. But my life began here, right? And in this book, it's called a memoir. Some people call it an autobiography. But for me, it was to talk about how growing up here shaped me in hugely important ways that carried with me throughout my career, because my roots are here and they go way back, right? And people ask me why I wrote this book. Well, lots of reasons, but one of them is for you, so that you could hear from someone of my generation talking about a path, a journey that I hope some of you, or hopefully all of you, see when you read this, because we've got books for you in there. I wanted to bring copies for all of you, so that if you read the book, there's something in there that you can connect with, because I've got messages in here for you. And I'm going to tell some stories that are embedded in this book today. So I grew up just on the other side of Rosecrans, right? In a community where there was an aunt, a tia, a tío, a abuelo, a padrino, a godfather in the community. So you couldn't get in too much trouble because people were, always keeping an eye on you, right? But I couldn't have known then why it was predominantly Mexican folks, right? Because I was growing up there and it was almost all Mexican. It was a little barrio, right? It was a little barrio. And I grew up in that barrio in the 1950s and in the part of the 1960s. And it was only later, after I had the opportunity to get an education at UCLA, that I understood why Mexican folks could only live in that section of Compton at that time, right? There were very few black folks. When my parents came to Compton, get this, 115 years ago. My father came from Michoacan, Mexico, during this huge migration of people from Mexico. First huge migration from Mexico to the United States in places like LA and Compton, and settled in that area, which we simply just called the barrio, right? Because that's where Mexican folks live. So that's where I grew up. And again, it was only later when I realized why that community came to be, why Mexican folks were there, and why so few African American folks were allowed to live in Compton at all when I was a little boy. But then we moved. You guys know where Richland Farms is, right? So we moved. The church in that part of Compton, it was a little barrio, as I mentioned, with a little chapel for the Mexican parishioners. I didn't realize then, as a kid, and only discovered later, that Mexican folks could not go to the white Catholic church in East Compton, right? They built a little chapel for the Mexican folks where my mother dragged me every Sunday to service, right? Where we had our first communions and our other religious ceremonies. But then the church, when I was about 10 years old, decided they needed to build a bigger church, so we lived right next to the church. They knocked our house down and we moved to Richland Farms. And it was a different experience because it was mostly white folks, no black folks whatsoever, but there were some Filipino folks, there were some Japanese American kids who, get this, Richland Farms, there's a reason they called it Richland Farms. On that part of Compton, it bordered this huge area. So imagine this, where the Freeway 91 cuts through, right? And all of those big manufacturing and light industry, the Compton Industrial Park, that was all open land. Those were farms. And a lot of the people that worked those farms were Japanese American farmers. Again, I didn't realize this as I got to know their children. They were the ones that came back from being interned during World War II simply because they were Japanese or Japanese American, right? And they lived on those farms, and I got to go to school with some of their children, right? And then I didn't understand why at that time in the late 1950s, long time ago, right, early 1960s, why the white folks were moving out practically overnight. West Compton was predominantly white when we moved over when I was 10 years old, about 1957, 58. And my elementary school, Longfellow Elementary, I don't know if you guys know where that is on the west side. By the time I left Longfellow and went to Walton Junior High, Walton Middle School, there was the first African American families that were allowed into Compton, right? Can you imagine? They were not allowed to live in Compton. But over where Centennial High is, you guys know where Centennial is, that was the first place that African Americans were allowed to live in Compton. And I got to know the children of those families that came in, the parents that came in. And it was a big deal for black folks to move into Compton at that time. Compton, for them, moving from South Central Los Angeles, now I understand this, at that time, 600,000 African Americans were cooped up in a part of South Central Los Angeles in which they were contained, right? They were not allowed to move to Inglewood or to Compton or to Linwood or a whole bunch of places, right? But that changed when I was a young kid. But I wasn't aware of that stuff, really. I didn't understand it. All I cared about was girls, cars, and sports, right? That's all I. And it wasn't until later that I understood why that happened, right? But it had a huge impact on me. You know why? West Compton turned black. My world turned black. By the time I was a ninth grader at Walton, we were about 95% African American, small Mexican population, a number of white kids, you can count them on two hands. My best friends were African American. My teammates were African American. The girl I liked was African American. So I grew up early on in almost an entirely Mexican community, right? Entirely Mexican community. Then I went to South Compton, where for just a few short years it was integrated, but then it became black. And I didn't realize this until later, until I started doing research on Compton. In 1962, the realtor said, we're going to divide Compton and we'll let the west side be black and brown, but we're going to keep the east side white. Now, again, didn't realize till I started doing research that this was a decision made by the realtors and Compton Unified School District. We're going to build a high school on the east side that'll be for the white kids and leave Compton High and Centennial for the black and Mexican kids and Pacific Islander kids. They're a small Pacific Islander community. All my brothers and sisters went to Compton High, by the way. That looks like a special campus being built there. I mean, way different from what I remember. So all my brother and sister went to Compton. I was expecting to go to Compton High, right? With all my friends from Walton playing basketball and football. But lo and behold, my sister, who had 17 years older than me, and kind of like, she was like the older sister, but almost mother in the family. And so I want you to understand this. My generation and her generation grew up in an era where being Mexican was not good. There was nothing in a society that said it was okay to be Mexican or to be African American or to be Asian American or to be Tongan or Samoan, right? So what did people do? They tried to assimilate as best they could, shed their ethnic identity, we're American. She happened to be very güerita, white, so she could pass. She passed all along, right? I didn't realize this at the time, but I got news in ninth grade, right? So I'm ready to go to college, to high school with my friends. And lo and behold, my sister says, we've sold the house and we're moving to the other side of Compton, right on the other side of the LA River, and you're going to go to Dominguez High. I ain't going to Dominguez High. I'll stay with my friends. You can move. 15-year-olds don't win those kind of battles, right? So I go to the segregated white high school. Not a black person in that school, right? Not one. Small Mexican population, all white because they'd segregated, right? They kept East and West Compton separate. But I fit in. I made friends. I played sports. I got into school politics, right? I become student body president. At the time, they're now busing black kids from the west side to the east side, to Dominguez High, to desegregate it. And I know a lot of these kids because they were 2 years younger than me at Walton, and they were coming over to Dominguez now. So I'm asked as student body president, as a kid that had been raised in West Compton, to serve as the chair of what they called the Human Relations Council at Dominguez, to help ease the racial tensions, because the boys were always causing the problem. The girls were not the problem at Dominguez. It were the boys. They were fighting. The black kids and the white kids were fighting every morning. And the school was concerned because they were fearing there might be a big race riot on campus. I knew this only later, again, because my brother, one of my older brothers, was on the Compton P.D. for 20 years. And so he remembers being put on alert in Dominguez High School, be careful because it might explode any time. I didn't know what I was doing trying to facilitate race relations back then, but the best I could. Did I understand it? No, because I was too naive. I didn't understand. I had exposure to the Mexican folks, to the white folks, to the black folks, to Asian folks, but I didn't understand it until I had an opportunity to get an education and learn about it, right? That opportunity did not exist for people of color, for the most part, in my generation. I was really lucky. The time was right. When I started UCLA a long time ago, right, 1966, there were almost 28,000 students at that campus. There were 50 Mexican Americans and about 100 blacks, and maybe 100, 150 Asian Americans. So, you walked around that campus. You did not see people of color. But I am so blessed that change occurred. Change was sweeping American society, the civil rights movement, what black folks had been arguing for and protesting about, the right to vote and for freedom. And in the post-civil rights movement with laws that guaranteed that we could not be, as people of color, be discriminated against in public institutions, and that we had a right to vote. And the first kids of color started to come to places like UCLA. And I was so fortunate because, let me tell you, early on, I was not a good student. I got into some trouble. I hated school. It wasn't until a teacher in the 6th grade that showed me the value of reading. And then my brothers, they were really good athletes at Compton High. The first Mexican-American kids to get scholarships to play football. And so it gave me this idea about college, and it was hugely important to think that I could actually go to college. And so I went to college. You guys have heard affirmative action, right? That occurs about 1967, 68 with the first kids of color coming to places like UCLA or Cal State Long Beach or other places, right? And that had a huge impact. I was pre-affirmative action. That's why there were so few kids of color there. But I was so blessed that by 1968 and 69, the first ethnic studies courses ever taught in the University of California system. I took the first African American studies course ever offered because I was attached to African American life and culture because of the Walton experience and my friends. The first Chicano Mexican American course ever offered in the University of California system. I took that and boom, it was like this light went on in my head and I said, oh my goodness, I'm beginning to understand not only race in American society, but my family, my community, our history. And it compelled me to learn more and more. So from that point on, I had a passion. I understood things that I didn't understand before. In fact, where do you think the first place that I did research, because I ended up writing a paper and then going to graduate school at UCLA, and where do you think I came back to do my first research? Compton. And what did I do? I tried to understand and write about the formation of the Mexican-American community here because I was thirsty to understand and to learn about that history. I went on to graduate school, and then I was the first. So yeah, I'm old, but 1975, I'm the first person in the United States. Get this. So this is what an opportunity created, right, for me and my cohort, my generation. I'm the first person in the United States to get a Ph.D. in American history with a specialization in Mexican-American history. And I knew when I finished that graduate school and that I was launching a career as a historian, that I was going to try to open up the door for other people like the door had been opened for me at UCLA. Because that's how you create social change. And I knew it. By that time, I knew it because I had studied social movements. I had studied African-American political movement. The beginning that I was part of what we called the Chicano movement, the first movement of Mexican-American students on university campuses and high school to say, we demand that we have more opportunity, and we demand that we learn, we have the opportunity to learn about ourselves, right? That was huge, right? That had not happened before. And I was so lucky that I was there at the beginning. How do you think a Mexican kid from Compton could end up at Stanford University? Well, that wasn't likely, right? They gave me a chance. It was affirmative action. They brought me there. They had not had many Mexican-American faculty on campus, right? There were like 7 or 8 black faculty. I was the 5th Mexican-American hired at that university out of 1,000 faculty, right? But I figured if I could make an impact there, because I wanted to write about Mexican Americans and other people of color, because that was my passion. If I could do that and get a foundation at Stanford, this great university, maybe I could help train the next generation of people doing this work. Maybe I could help the first group of Mexican American, African American, and Asian American students to, like UCLA, they were starting to populate the student population at Stanford. If I could help them, if I could inspire them like I was inspired at UCLA, that'll have an impact. And 4 decades later, I look back and I write about it in this book, and I see what those students did and are continuing to do. And they are committed to change, and they are facilitating change across America, right? Not only teaching you guys, but on the cabinet, a presidential cabinet, some of my students are now. And others that gained a passion like mine, like this woman sitting next to me here, who had the opportunity to go to UC Santa Cruz. She was inspired to do something. And when I learned about Abigail and Mark and what they had created here, I said, this is precisely the kind of thing that we need in our communities. And as I learned more about it, I asked Abigail, I want to meet you guys. I want to see you because you are me. We are linked. Yeah, I'm way older than you. I'm the abuelito. I'm the grandpa. I'm the papa, right? But I wrote this book for you. And I wrote this book for my grandchildren. And I wrote this book, as some of you know, next year, California, every high school in the state of California will require an ethnic studies course. Right? That's a huge. My generation could not have dreamt of possibly doing that. We were just hard at work at writing books and teaching students about ethnic studies. But the thought of 50 years later, after we started this ethnic studies initiative, that all California high school students would have the opportunity wow. And I was happy to be involved with it. I worked with the Assemblyman Jose Medina and the staff and his staff in the California legislature to get this bill passed. And I remember sitting there in front of the California Assembly Committee on Education when they asked us to come before them to make the argument why this was so important. And I thought about Compton, right? Because it's in my corazón, it's in my soul, it's in my heart. And I would give my left thumb, whatever, my leg, had something like that been available to me back then so that I wouldn't have had to have waited to college, that either in middle school or high school, this world could have opened up to me so that I understood myself, I understood my family, I understood my community, I understood society better, right? That's an amazing opportunity. And so I wrote that book for you, and although I'm hoping these students in high schools will read part of this, right? Because it's meant for them. So few people of my generation have written books like this to tell our stories, right? Because our stories are an American story. It's a story about social change. It's about education that can transform your life. And it's a hopeful story, right? My parents' generation, they were happy to have had the opportunity to make a life for themselves, a really tough life, right? It was difficult for them back then. Imagine coming into Compton and seeing a sign that said no Mexicans and dogs allowed in 1928. Can you imagine that? Or if you were an African American, you go to Inglewood and there was a big sign as you entered the city that said, "Don't let the sun set on you here," N-word. Can you imagine seeing that? That was so hard for them, right? But they had hope for the next generation, just like I have hope for your generation. All right, let me end on this. You guys got an obligation, right? There's been change. And we want you to benefit from every bit of that change. Every opportunity you get, you take that opportunity. Because people before me fought to get that opportunity available for you. They gave opportunity for me that previous generations simply didn't have. Education, understanding, right? And importantly, to have pride in who we are. You know how important that is? You guys can have that. That was something that happened only with my generation. No, it's partly in the larger society, right? We had that confidence. We had that sense of who we were within our communities, right? So we knew that family gave us that sense of pride, but not the larger society, but your generation has that opportunity. A place like Color Compton facilitates that, right? It is one of those organizations built to give you that confidence, to give you opportunity. All right, but you can't sit back. You got to be prepared for that opportunity. You do everything you possibly can to get yourself prepared for that opportunity. Because believe me, there's opportunity. There are things that you cannot imagine what the possibilities are if you prepare yourself and you link up with Abigail and Mark and the other folks. And everywhere you go, there are going to be people that are going to want to help you. But you got to be prepared, right? And when you're prepared and you gain that opportunity, then you have an obligation. You have an obligation to give back in whatever way makes sense for you and whichever way you choose. But that's how change occurs. I've seen it. I've been part of it. And it's one of the most beautiful things about American democracy. Because look, as a historian, I've written stuff that when I sit and reread it, it makes me cry what they did to people who were deemed to be different in the past, right? And when I think about the beauty of a functional, multiracial society of which we were all a part, it gives me enormous pride that we've made progress. And you are part of that progress. You are part of that next generation. And when I saw it at Stanford, and I see it here, I see it almost everywhere I go, I look for it. That is, the historical divides that separated Americans by race, by ethnicity, by culture, by language, by religion, that was still so obvious when I was a little kid and when I was your age. There's so many examples where that is broken down. And it's one of the beautiful things for me to see a multiracial group of people come together to be friends, to build relationships, to get married. I've seen a lot of multiracial relationships at Stanford over the years, and I love to see it. I love to see it. My family is part of it. My family, my grandchildren are African American, Japanese American, Tongan, Mexican American, Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish, right? That's California. You guys are California, right? You guys are So when I meet with groups like you guys, and I go out to the high schools, and I'm doing more of that all the time to try to get the word out, the message. It's because we have moved this society, despite all its problems, right? Despite all its problems, we've moved this society to be a better society. And that's a beautiful thing, right? That's a beautiful thing, that American democracy can work. A couple weeks ago, I was surprised when Kamala Harris, and by the way, Kamala is a manifestation of that. She's a representation of the America that we want to build. But I won't go into politics here because I'll be here for hours. But all right. Those of you in high school, still, think about this. Kamala Harris, about 2 weeks ago, and again, I was surprised but so gratified to hear this. She identified 4 or 5 freedoms that are crucial to a multiracial democracy that America is, right? And that she wants to push further, right? To help progress. And she mentioned one of them as the freedom to learn our full and truth history as a people and as a nation. And when I heard that, I said, wow, that's what I've been trying to do all my whole life. And I thought about, as I mentioned to you, the ethnic studies curriculum that all high school students are going to be exposed to. But you guys in high school have a role to play here too. When high school students say, yes, we're happy ethnic studies is here, but we don't want the minimum. We want more ethnic studies. We want more people teaching this. We want more activities that give us a sense of understanding the diversity in our communities and our society, right? So push it. Right? Get together with some other students and say, let's cultivate this. Let's make it happen. Let's make it work. Because believe me, folks, there are a lot of people, there are groups in this state and across the nation that don't want ethnic studies in California schools to work. And they're working hard to undermine it. And we ain't gonna let them. Because it's here to stay, and we're gonna make sure that your younger brothers and sisters are gonna have access to a really quality ethnic studies curriculum. One other thing, and I'll end on this note. You guys have a role to play here in Compton. I wrote this book in part 2 because I want to see people read that last chapter, which is a chapter of hope. It's a chapter that I wrote because I was inspired when I came back to Compton. I left in 1975. I went up to Stanford University in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I didn't have, though I read about Compton, and of course, when you read about Compton through the 1980s and 1990s, what do you hear about? Drugs, gangs, violence. And then our oldest son came to Compton after he graduated, decided he wanted to launch his career here as a teacher, and he went to start teaching in early 2000s at Vanguard Middle School on the west side. And so that was my opportunity to come back to Compton and really reacquaint myself with my hometown. And what I found, there was a lot of problems. You guys know there's still a lot of problems in this community. But the other side, because as a historian, I wanted to understand more that was being told to us in television and the mass media. And as I dug down deeper, I found some really inspirational things. There were teachers here changing the lives of students because they were committed. There were people in nonprofit organizations. Of course, later I found out about Color Compton. But already at that time in Compton, doing all kinds of beautiful work to make opportunities available for people in Compton. But that story wasn't being told. I'm telling that story in this book. Because I want people to know there's hope. But it's your generation's responsibility to help change the narrative of this city. Because you folks are going to be already doing some wonderful things here and elsewhere. But as you launch your careers, don't forget about this place, wherever it may take you. And you have an opportunity to shift the idea about Compton, the story about Compton, the narrative about Compton, because you're insiders. You grew up here. You know it. You know there's some good things going on here. It's not all bad, but the public doesn't know it until we tell it. So you take every opportunity that you can to tell that story about the good things. Don't shy away from the bad things. We're trying to improve those things. But tell the stories about the good things. So people need to hear that. Gustavo Arellano writes about these things all the time. And he's a voice for people to understand that there are other sides to the story, right? And I learned that coming back here and working with folks, and now working with Color Compton, to change that narrative, change that story about Compton, because people need to know about this place because it's on the move. And whether you end up coming back and living in Compton or you go away like I did, you're always connected, right? So when I see you guys here, I'm connected to every one of you, beautiful people. I really am. And it does my soul. Why do you think I said Compton in my soul? It's there, right? When I come back here, I go to that community. I go past Compton College. I was there a couple weeks ago with Abigail and Mark, and it's that core of me, right? That part of me, that identity for me. And so when I see you folks, the one that reminds me when I was a kid back in Compton, right? But it is always a part of me, as you are a part of me as we meet here today. So I'm going to end on that note, and I want to, we have a discussion. This is like a little seminar. By the way, I retired 8 years ago. I miss being in a classroom like this, right? I got to have some input with young folks, because I'd love teaching, right? I'd love teaching students, And when I'm with young people, it's a part of who I am, right? So let's have a little discussion here. Any kind of question. You can ask me personal stuff. You can ask me about growing up here. You can ask me about UCLA when I was a student there. You can ask me about being at Stanford, whatever, fair game. And don't hesitate to ask me anything that's on your mind. Yes?
How long did it take you to put the book together? Because I hear sometimes it takes short because you get inspired so much.
Now, that's a really excellent question, because originally when my son started teaching here, I had already decided that I wanted to come back to Compton to do a study, right? So I'm an academic, right? Professor, right? We have to write, but it usually is only for college students and other professors, right? So it was going to be an academic book. But then as I learned more about the city, I said, it needs to be a book eventually that the general audience might be interested in reading. And then of course, that was like 20 years ago. And they had me doing a lot of different things at Stanford. So I was involved in a lot of administrative things, building new centers for the study of race and ethnicity in undergraduate programs, and hiring faculty of color. So it wasn't until I had retired in 2018, I had some time to write. But I was still busy, and then COVID hit. What else was I going to do with my time rather than sitting there in front of the computer and writing this book? So it took me about 2.5 years to pull it all together. And the other side of it is, when you're trained as an academic, you're trained as a scholar, you're not trained like Gustavo Arellano to write for a general audience. We're trained to write very narrowly, all the footnotes and this. This is a different book, right? Because I wanted it to reach out to people like you guys and other people. So it's not easy to write this kind of book when it's all first person. So it was both fun to remember growing up here and the journey through UCLA and Stanford and elsewhere, but it was always a struggle to try to do it in a way that I'm hoping that people can read it and be able to not say, "Oh God, that's so esoteric," or "That's so academic," right? So it was about 2.5, 3 years, almost 3 years. It's a very lengthy process that you have to go through, right? And in the end, you're happy when a book is published, right? But good question. Other questions? Yes.
You were talking about how you were in charge of human relations at your high school. Like, how did you resolve that, if you could? Like, how did you best go into that and resolve the tension between the two?
Yeah, right. How does a 17-year-old handle race? All right, little backstory. So I told you guys I was on the West Side, right? As it became predominantly African American. And by that time, I already knew by the 9th grade that I wanted to go to college. Somehow that was embedded in my consciousness, because my brothers and I wanted to play basketball, right? I was a basketball player, and I always wanted to go to UCLA because they had the best basketball teams. But I'm only 5'9". But because of, I didn't realize it because it was natural to me. I had Mexican friends, Japanese friends, and African American friends at Walton. And the administration apparently recognized it, and I was in school politics, right? I was in several clubs, and I was vice president of the school, and they resurrected this thing called Miss and Mr. Brotherhood, people who represent the ability to get to interact across racial groups. I didn't understand it then. the reason I liked it because the girl that I liked was Miss Brotherhood, really pretty Ruby Cook, you know. I didn't realize at the time. I go to the white high school, the segregated white high school. Get this. So this is the backstory. So I'm new to the school, right? 2 weeks into the academic year as a sophomore at Dominguez High School. I don't know many people. I know the football teammates because we start up a little before the academic year. So I knew those teammates. And then I get a call from the vice principal. You do not want a call from the vice principal because they usually, right? You guys know what vice principals do. And I said to myself, and they summons me out of English class. And I said, oh shit, I didn't do anything wrong. What did I do? And he brings me and says, hi Al, and we welcome to Dominguez, right? And here I'm shaking because I think he's gonna, whatever. And he said, well, we know that you were a student leader at Walton. We know you were Mr. Brotherhood. And that summer after my 9th grade, the Optimus Club of Compton had made me the boy of the month. And he says, we know you're Optimus Boy of the Month. We, meaning him or the school administration, want you to run for sophomore class president. Wait a minute. I don't know anyone here. And I told him, I said, I'm new to the school. I don't know anyone here. No one knows me. He says, well, we think, give it a thought. Well, I ran, and I won. I think the election was rigged, though, right? They knew. So here's why this sounds like conspiracy. They knew East Compton was going to be desegregated. They knew the black kids were going to come in. But the guy was smart because once I became sophomore class president, I started to know a lot more people, felt better at that school, right? Felt grounded. And from then on, I was involved in school politics so that I ran for student body president and won, right? So I was the student body president when they desegregated the school, and I knew the black kids, I knew the Mexican kids, I knew the white kids. And so what do they have me do? Think about ways to see if we can help ease tensions. So I called together, I had a lot of teammates, so I get the African American kids and the Mexican kids and white kids who are playing sports. All right, guys, help me out here. We got to bring the kids in to see if we can ease some of the tension, because the fights are breaking out every day at lunchtime and the morning snack time, whatever that was called back then. And so we called together this big, filled up the cafeteria with probably 100 people, right? And I didn't know what to do. I basically said, we're here together. We got to figure out a way. And then I threatened them too, because I figured a threat from the vice principal always works. I said, the vice principal's going to bust your ass. And these are all boys, right? But there are no girls, because again, the boys were the problem. And he's going to kick your booty out of the school if you get in fights anymore, right? So the threat always helps. But, that wasn't moving many people, though. And then I remember this guy, he's such a sweetheart. His name was Laurie Cuthbert, black kid, teammate from football. And there was kind of dead silence, and I think the vice principal made this one group of white kids. They were kind of like the surfer boys, and they were the ones that were fighting a lot with the black kids, right? And so I think he made them come. But the rest of the folks, they came because, they were teammates, and we said invite other people. But it wasn't moving along. And I remember Laurie Cuthbert, tall, good-looking black kid, and with all sincerity, in this tense room, he stands up and he says, can't we just have cookies and milk after school and talk about, and everyone starts cracking up, right? Because he released the tension. And then some people started talking, yeah, I remember one of the black kids who I knew from Walton. He was seventh grade when I was in the ninth grade, and he says, "We know UL, but we know," and he pointed to the white kids, and "we know you don't want us here." And he was being honest, right? And then there was some other discussion, but I think what it did is for people to realize that fighting was only going to exacerbate things, right? And then the threat helped too, because there weren't a whole lot of fights after that. And I don't know what did it, but maybe it helped. But I'll tell you one other thing, and it's still very vivid in my mind. I called together a lunchtime meeting of students in our library. And it was a mixed group, right? So it's African-American kids and Mexican kids and white kids and very few Asian, only like 6 or 7 Asian kids in our school. And it was packed. And I didn't choose the speakers, but there were 3 speakers, 3 girls. African-American girl, Mexican girl, white girl. And I remember the African-American girl, this is why it's so kind of etched into my memory, because I was so stupid, so ignorant, and so naive. She explains, and it's 100 years after the Civil War had ended, right? To end slavery and to start a new era, we had hoped, for African American people in the South primarily. And she said something to the effect, slavery is the legacy that's basically, she said, slavery is the legacy that still haunts and affects us as black people. And I stopped her in the middle of her comment. I said, that was 100 years ago. What impact could that have?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I saw her kind of dejected. I actually have a sentence in here that says, I hope you read this because I am so damn sorry. Please forgive me, right? Because I was so stupid. Of course slavery had everything to do with African American, but those are the things I tried to do. But again, 17-year-old, naive as can be. I wish I could have returned as an adult, right? After having all this experience in race and ethnic history, right? I would tell a different story. But it was a tense moment in Compton, right? It was a tense moment. But within 3 or 4 years, Dominguez High School becomes predominantly African American, smaller Mexican population, so a very different time, right? That was a very long, but I wanted to give you that backdrop to it because, I write about it, but it was one of those moments, right? One of those moments for me that as I look back and realize how Compton was changing at that moment when I was about ready to leave to go to college, right? Other questions come? Yes.
All right, well, does anybody else have a question before I ask you?
There's one. Yeah.
I wanted to ask, being one of the younger or earlier generations of Chicanos attending UCLA, did you witness or experience like any of the like student activist movements?
Oh, I'm sorry. What?
Any like student activists?
Oh yeah. It was the start. It was start of what we call the Chicano movement. It was a student activism. So you understand, in 1967 and 68, the first affirmative action recruitment and admissions policies go into across the country, right? And places like UCLA are going to be impacted. So imagine this. In 1966, when I started, there were 600,000 African Americans, as I mentioned, in South Central Los Angeles. And within 25-mile radius of UCLA, 650,000 Mexican Americans. At that time, the Latinx population was 97% Mexican origin, right? And so for the first time, in beginning 1968, really, and at most universities, the first small cohort of African American and Mexican American students come onto campus. At the same time that you have a Black Panther movement, right, in California, started in Oakland, but it comes to down to Southern California. And you have student protests cropping up all over higher education. Why? Because you had the first visible populations of Chicano students, Mexican American students, African American, and they were saying, we want ethnic studies, we want cultural activities, social activities, because none existed, right? And there was a lot of racism on campus, right? So yeah, I was right there when it started, and I was right there at UCLA when the first ethnic centers started. And so I had the good graces of being a senior at UCLA and a first-year graduate student, because that's where I stayed for my graduate study, to create the first ethnic centers at Stanford, at UCLA. And that was hugely important for me because as a student, we got to see that the university could change in a positive way, right? To create something to help facilitate the education of not only that particular ethnic group or racial group, people of color, but for the university as a whole. And so that shaped me deeply because that's what when I went to Stanford, that's what I wanted to do, right? So yeah, the student movement was hugely important. That's why when I tell you guys, students, you guys have a voice. You all, whether it's high school, junior high, high school, certainly college, you guys, students, when you get together, hugely impactful, right? Hugely impactful.
I wanted to ask, what was the difficult part about coming back to Compton and trying to rekindle that relationship with your community? And if so, like, how did you kind of get through it? Because I kind of understand, like, as you kind of go out and have more experience and stuff, and wanting to come back to your community and give back, like, the community's still here and still changing, even though you're away.
Yeah,
So
excellent,
sometimes it
excellent
changes
question.
Even though you still want to be a part of it.
Excellent question. Because it's 30 years later, right? And here comes this professor from Stanford, that elite institution. He's coming back, what, he just wants to study us? That's what I was fearful, right? And so I had to very consciously position myself that I'm not here as one of these academics coming here to study you folks, right? To study the black community or the Mexican or the whatever, right? That I'm from Compton, right? My roots are here. My son is teaching over on the west side at Vanguard. One of my students at Stanford, Latina student, Mexican American student, came here and opened up a legal aid office. Right? Luz Herrera, right? Yeah, one of the wonderful students that I came across, started the first legal services for folks on the east side. I teamed up with her. She started making connections with a whole bunch of other people in grassroots organizations. We started a little group called, what do we call it? Compton Community Partners, with the hope of galvanizing both the African American community and the Latino community to work together, because at that time there was a lot of tension. As you guys know this, there was a lot of tension, misunderstanding between Latino folks and black folks, right? And one of the things we want to do is, how could we help facilitate communication and understanding to help ameliorate some of that tension, right? Because gangs at that point, I was reaching out to the Catholic priest at Our Lady of Victory, because he was doing a lot of good work on the ground to facilitate that, right? To facilitate more harmonious relations. And so it was through that avenue that people realized I was there not as the academic to study, but as someone returning to his hometown to try to help as best he could, though I was 400 miles away, right? And I think it worked in the end. They realized that I was authentic about it and not just, I want to take advantage of and study you guys, right? But there's always that apprehension, right? Even if you're from the community, you come from a place in our university way up there, they've had a lot of people come in and study, so you keep them at a distance.
Thank you.
But that's a good question. And then meeting the folks, and building the partnerships and the collaborations, right? And they can see when you're authentic and you're phony, right? And if you can build that trust and confidence, then you can get something done.
And then maybe, one more question so that we're also here so that you all can share some of the ways that you're also changing the narrative in Compton, right? And so we can maybe do one more question, and then you all can still kind of come up and talk to Al. We'll all be here, but I want to also make sure that we hear from you all, right, and this wonderful work that you have done. So maybe one last question as we wrap up.
And then I have books for you after that.
Yes, so we'll kind of relocate. But yeah, one last question.
You were talking about how you became a professor and like you were like 5 out of like you were like the 5th Mexican teacher there out of like 1,000 colleagues who were like white, and like how would you describe your integration into that space? Like was it like smooth, or were you like facing a brick wall that you were trying to push down and get into that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because we were the first to come in these institutions that were almost exclusively white. Someone asked me, I was giving a talk the other day in Pasadena, and someone said, how did you we have a terminology, did you feel the imposter syndrome? Yeah, you're damn right I felt the imposter syndrome. One of the things that was so important is that I had confidence, right? I had enough confidence that people gave me, family, the mentors at UCLA, they said, you can do this. And yeah, it's going to be hard, and there are not going to be many of you there, but if you can do it, and you do it well, it'll make a difference. And then I think I learned as well, reach out to the people regardless of race and ethnic background that seem to make a connection to you or want to make a connection to you. Use them as mentors and support systems. And what's interesting is, yeah, there weren't many of us. We were a little community though. We were a tight little community of faculty of color because we knew we were on a mission, right? We knew we were on a mission. They made the mistake of highly educating us. We knew what the score was, right? We knew about institutions. We knew, and we were learning more and more about ways to figure out how to make it in these institutions. So, but there were some really wonderful people. There were some old faculty members who knew that a person like me was different and unique, and that we were among the first of the faculty of color to be there. And they reached out. They brought us into their homes, my wife and I, and made us feel comfortable. And I look back at some of those people and say, thank goodness that there were people that wanted to help. And so look for those people. Look for the people anywhere you go, right, that are reaching out to you, and embrace them and make them a part of your community. Right? Build your community. Build that network of people that will support you, and you will support them. And that will really make you feel more comfortable. And there were a lot of good people, right? And then those people are the ones that helped build my career at that place. They were the people that helped me change the institution over a long time, right? And then I played the same role. When new people came in, I did that. But it's a kind of a universal thing. Look for those people, regardless of who they are, right? That share something, share a value, a principle, friendliness with you. Build those relationships. And those are really important wherever you go. So as you end on that note, I thank you guys. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you so so much. You know, we talk about the title is Compton In My Soul, but I feel like this whole conversation really feels my soul, right? And just to hear you talk, I feel like we're just hanging out at like, you know, the Theo's, the grandparents' house, like listening, and that's what it's supposed to be, right? This is like our shared knowledge and education and kind of hearing each other's stories. So thank you so much for blessing
It
us
was
with
my
that.
pleasure. I'm so happy to be here with you guys.
We have some books for you all, so we'll have Al kind of go over there, and we're gonna switch over so that Al could also learn about some of the work that you all have been doing. So our archiving fellows will be able to tell us a little bit about this project that they've been working on. So we're gonna move into that, and we could take a photo here, maybe before.